All right, let's dive into a pretty epic story today. A 3,000-year journey, really, that leads to one of the biggest legal projects in modern history, China's first ever all-in-one civil code.
And that's the central mystery, isn't it? I mean, think about it. A civilization that gave the world paper, printing, the compass. Why did it take until the 21st century to put together a unified civil code? To figure that out, we have to rewind the clock way, way back to a fundamental clash of ideas.
You see, for thousands of years, China's entire worldview was shaped by this deep philosophical tug of war. And it's a conflict that put the very idea of a formal written law on the back foot from the very beginning.
Okay, so let's get one thing straight. Ancient China wasn't some lawless Wild West. It had huge, incredibly detailed legal codes for each dynasty. But here's the catch. They weren't anything like what we think of as law today. They were almost all about punishment. There was no clean line between a private issue, like a business disagreement, and a crime against the emperor. Everything was seen through the lens of punishment. And this is where you really see that core tension. On one side, you've got Confucianism and this idea of li. The thinking here is that society should run on morality, on social rituals, on everyone knowing their place in relationships. In this world, having to go to court means society has failed. But on the other side, you've got the legalists and fa. Their view, the only way to run a state is with clear, strict laws and punishments. So the emperor needed fa to rule, but the culture itself deeply valued li.
So what do you get when you mix these two? Well, you end up with this really strange hybrid system. The government used fa, the law, but it was completely shaped by li, that Confucian worldview. Scholars call it the Confucianization of the law. What it means is, yeah, there were laws on the books, but they were designed to reinforce the social hierarchy. A nobleman and a peasant were just not equal in the eyes of the law because the whole idea of harmony was based on everyone staying in their lane. And you know what? In its own way, the system actually held together for centuries.
But then, the 19th century happened, and everything changed. China's long, self-imposed isolation was just shattered by the arrival of Western powers, who brought a completely alien concept of law with them. The 19th century was just one relentless shock after another. First, the Opium Wars, which were these brutal military defeats that exposed just how far behind China was technologically. Those defeats led to what became known as the unequal treaties, which were seen as a deep national humiliation. And when the Chinese people fought back with the Boxer Rebellion, this massive anti-foreigner uprising, it was crushed by an international army, which only gave foreign powers even more control.
And if you want to understand just how humiliating this all was, you have to know about this one concept, extraterritoriality. It sounds complicated, but it's pretty simple. It meant that a Westerner in China was basically immune to Chinese law. If they got into a dispute or committed a crime, they weren't tried by Chinese courts. Nope. They were tried in their own courts, by their own judges. The Western excuse was that China's legal system was just too primitive. For China, this was a complete loss of sovereignty, and it stung badly.
So the really critical part of the story is how China reacted to all this pressure, especially when you look next door. Japan was facing the exact same thing, but its response was totally different. They launched the Meiji Restoration, went all in on industrialization, and quickly adopted Western-style legal codes. China, on the other hand, resisted. It tried a few reforms, but they were just too little too late. And eventually, that ancient imperial system just crumbled under the pressure. Now, if you thought the 19th century was chaotic, the 20th century was a total roller coaster. China's search for a new identity led to these wild swings, from trying to copy-paste the West's laws to rejecting the very idea of law itself. So once the emperor was gone, the new Republic of China decided to go for broke on modernization. Their plan? Look at what the successful Western countries were doing, especially Germany and Japan, and basically just copy their legal systems. They created this whole new set of codes called the Six Laws. It was this massive top-down attempt to create a modern legal system pretty much overnight.
But yeah, there was one massive, glaring problem. You can't just drop a completely foreign legal system on top of hundreds of millions of people who've lived by ancient traditions for thousands of years. For the average person, the real law was still village customs and Confucian ethics. So the Six Laws existed on paper, but in reality, they barely made a dent in everyday life.
And then, the pendulum swung violently in the other direction. When Mao Zedong and the Communist Party came to power in 1949, they didn't just tweak the Six Laws, they threw the whole thing out. This kicked off a period that scholars call legal nihilism. We're talking a complete wipeout.
Law schools? Shut down. Courts? Suspended. Law itself was seen as this corrupt Western idea. It was completely replaced by the ideology and the political proclamations of the party. Officially, Mao wanted a total, clean break from China's past. He publicly attacked Confucius, blaming his philosophy for all the backwardness that had made China weak and vulnerable. But this is where the story gets really, really interesting. Check this out. It's a fantastic paradox. Despite trashing Confucius, Mao's actual approach to law was weirdly similar. Both of them had a deep distrust of formal written law. Both believed that the ultimate authority came from ideology, party doctrine for Mao, moral virtue for Confucius, not from some technical legal expert. And they both preferred to solve problems outside of a formal court system. It just goes to show how deep that cultural DNA really runs.
Okay, so that brings us to the modern era, the final act of this story. After Mao's death, China started down a new path of economic reform. And it's this path that would finally, and very pragmatically, lead to the creation of its first modern legal code.
The new game plan was called socialism with Chinese characteristics. So what is that? Well, it's a total hybrid. It's not pure capitalism. It's not pure socialism. You have these gigantic state-owned companies operating right alongside a super dynamic private sector. You have market forces, but also state planning. And this new, incredibly complex economy desperately needed a functional legal system to keep the whole thing from falling apart.
But this time, they didn't just copy the West again. They did something uniquely Chinese, very pragmatic. You could almost call it an inverted approach. See, in the West, you usually start with a grand philosophical civil code and work your way down. China did the opposite. They started from the bottom up. First, they passed specific laws for things like contracts and trade. Then, in 1986, they created a set of general principles to act as a foundation. And only after decades of trial and error did they finally add all the detailed parts to create the finished code in 2021.
And the final product of this long, winding road is pretty fascinating. It is, without a doubt, a modern legal code. It deals with stuff like data privacy, e-commerce, digital contracts, and even personality rights. It definitely borrows ideas from Western law, but it's been carefully adapted to fit China's unique social and political reality. Just like its economy, it's a true hybrid. Which leaves us with the big final question, right? Is this brand new code a sign that China is finally moving towards global legal norms, becoming more like the West? Or is it something else? A really sophisticated, custom-built tool designed not just to manage its economy, but to strengthen its own unique political model for the 21st century. That's the question at the heart of this incredible 3,000-year story.
Knowledge transcends time. Truth endures.